Okay, welcome back. So in this section, first, I want to focus on what Gadamer says about language as being essentially dialogical, of language having its full realization only in dialogue. But there's something I passed by that I should mention briefly, and that is in his essay, Man and Language, he talks about the universality of language. This is going to be really important for his debates later with Habermas, but I think the understanding of the universality of language is clear once we lay the groundwork for, let's call it, the ubiquity of language, the essential role language plays in perceptual and conceptual intelligibility of the world. Once we realize that there's no other way by which we make the world intelligible except through language, we realize that language is inescapable. In that sense, language is universal in that sense. Okay, and that is one of the main things Gadamer says about language in Man and Language. I want to turn to now this idea of language and dialogue, not only because it is important for Gadamer's account of language, but because it's one of the places where Gadamer's views clearly connect up with Miranda Fricker's views about hermeneutic justice. In the essay, Gadamer talks about the I-lessness of language. And what he means by that is that in the use of language, there is the self-forgetfulness. In the use of language, there also is a kind of giving oneself over to language for the sake of working to make something intelligible. That is, we are sort of empowering language to make things clear to ourselves. And we do that most effectively, most naturally, in our interaction, in our dialogue with others, because language is a social medium that is shared. So the idea, and that's the way in which we might say that language is eyeless. It is in the play of interaction with others and language, trying to become clear about the subject matter that we share, that language does its work, its disclosive work. We've already seen Gadamer talk about the importance of relating to others through dialogue, and taken seriously, not just that others are coherent, not just others are rational, but that others are speaking the truth. So within Gadamer's account of dialogue, there is a kind of ethic of dialogue built into this. And so there is a kind of ethic of language use that is not just an ethical virtue, but an epistemic virtue. That is, he thinks that things will only properly become perspicuous to us through language if it's a shared activity with others, if we are working with others to become clear about something. Now, there are obvious parallels here to what Fricker says about testimonial justice and hermeneutical justice, because what Fricker calls for in her book and her essays is a kind of virtuous hearing. And in virtuous hearing, what you do is you try to adjust for the injustices that make it difficult for somebody else to articulate their views or make it difficult for somebody else to be taken seriously in their presentation of their own experiences. So we give them a kind of credibility boost that allows them to have more credibility than they might have otherwise in order to compensate for the ways in which society may diminish their credibility. In the case of hermeneutical injustice, she calls for what she'll call a proactive listening, a kind of listening that treats somebody's lack of articulateness not as a problem of them and their mental capacity, but as a problem of language itself, as something that needs to be overcome together as we take seriously that they are trying to say something that we do not yet have a shared vocabulary for, or maybe they don't have the shared vocabulary for, and part of our job is to help them acquire the vocabulary that best articulates their viewpoint. But this kind of proactive listening, then, Fricker calls for as a way to compensate for the injustices that may be systemically present in our language and in our practices of making things intelligible. There's a clear parallel there with what Gadamer says about dialogue and how dialogue could function. But there's also a difference. For Gadamer, let's start with Fricker. For Fricker, she really thinks about dialogue as being an exchange of beliefs and positions. Right? I have my view, I have my position on something, Someone else has their view, their position. Because of our situation of hermeneutical injustice, either they are not as able to be as articulate about their position as they would like to be, or perhaps because of testimonial injustice, they are not taken as seriously in their presentation of the position as I am. But for Fricker, the dialogue is effectively an exchange of positions where each person states their position, and then there's a question about which one has the credibility to win the day. This propositional level of this understanding of dialogue as a kind of exchange of propositions, right? Where the problem then is some people do not have the resources to access the propositions that best reflect their experiences and their position. It's very different from how Gadamer understands what is going on in dialogue. Gadamer understands dialogue as a kind of collaborative activity of coming anew together to articulate an experience or a phenomenon, or as he says, a subject matter. I mean, for Gadamer, he's very academically focused. He's really a professor through and through, an ancient scholar through and through. So his models are things like Plato's Republic. But the idea would be that you are working together with another person or a group of people or 60 people to try to better understand what is going on in Plato's Republic. And in doing so, it's not that you have your view and they have their view, and then it's a question of the credibility or epistemic status of the views. But in every occasion, you are working anew to try to find ways to articulate yourself with others to better understand the subject matter. So articulation is a collaborative project. It's important too for Gadamer's view, and in thinking about articulation, that articulation is not just a generic term. Articulation varies across contexts. I'm thinking of there's YouTube videos of people who are tasked with articulating the Big Bang Theory, something like this, and they have to explain it to a 5-year-old, they have to explain it to a high schooler, and they have to explain it to a physicist, right? And they're very different kinds of explanations. They need to put them in words in very different ways. And often they're better at explaining things to the physicist than they're explaining to the 5-year-old child. But it means that in some sense that what it means to be articulate is going to vary from situation to situation for the expectations of what someone has to offer and to say. So one of the ways then that from a Gadamerian perspective, we could talk about dealing with hermeneutic injustice is by shifting our expectations of articulateness, right? Allowing a different standard for what counts as articulate in situations where we don't share the resources to make something articulate, right? Also, understand the process of coming to language as collaborative, right? So we are both engaged in this process at the same time. And it means that our role is not simply to be a proactive listener, to be receptive to the ideas, but to struggle with the person to articulate with them our joint experiences, our experiences and their experiences. It's a joint activity. It means that we recognize that we are being experimental in our own word choices and vulnerable in our own word choices, and that we are always trying anew to make sense of things just as they are, and that we have limitations and they have limitations, and part of the activity is working out these limitations collaboratively together. It's a very different idea of what happens in dialogue than what Fricker talks about, and we can see how it's connected to this phenomenological idea of trying to bring things to intelligibility through language. Let me give a personal example. So in grad school, you're constantly asked to explain your dissertation by friends, by professors, by potential employers. And so I did that all the time. I became very good at it, various lengths for various different audiences, except there was one professor. His name was Paul Weithman. I think he's still there. He's a very nice guy, and he would ask me about my dissertation, and I would just fall inarticulate. There was something about talking to him about the dissertation that would just render me a babbling fool. I was putting pressure on myself to explain things in a way. I was internalizing a kind of pressure on myself to explain things in a way that he would recognize as being philosophically interesting, engaging, and legitimate. And it was no fault of his own, but if we were in his position, we could recognize this sort of thing is happening. We can recognize the ways in which the other person is falling inarticulate in front of us. And we could adjust our relation to them in ways that help them feel more vulnerable, that allow them to experiment with language, that help them to find words where they don't have them otherwise, and maybe where they have them otherwise in other circumstances, other situations, in other relationships, but they for whatever reason aren't finding them in this moment. So this is something that really makes sense in Gadamer's account of dialogue. That makes a little less sense in Fricker's account of dialogue. This helps us understand how hermeneutical justice could work when we focus specifically on Gadamerian dialogue. Now, as it turns out, there has already been serious work done by Gadamer scholars on the relation between Gadamer's hermeneutics and testimonial justice. One of the texts I recommended for these sessions was a piece by Cynthia Nielsen, for example. She talks about Gadamer and testimonial justice. And I thought, well, on day 3, I could lay out their various views and positions, connecting together hermeneutics and testimonial justice and epistemic justice more generally. But I thought even better, I could just interview them. So at this point, I'm going to invite to join the conversation Cynthia Nielsen, Georgia Warnke, and Lauren Bartold to talk about their views on the connection between hermeneutics and epistemic injustice. First up is Cynthia Nielsen, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at University of Dallas. She's also she's also on the executive committee of the North American Society for Philosophical Hermeneutics, NASP, the outgoing president of that society, and the host of our conference this fall at Dallas. Cynthia Nielsen, thank you for joining us. Your piece on Gadamer and Fricker and testimonial justice was one of the main motivations for my topic choice for these talks.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in testimonial justice and saw it connected to hermeneutics?
So I've had an interest for some time, right, in thinking about how certain narratives and discourses basically, play a significant role in shaping various social identities. Also, and how this relates to issues of justice, human freedom, human flourishing, or when it comes to racialized discourses, the lack thereof. And as you know, I've also had an interest in Gadamer's work for quite some time now, and really appreciate, for example, his emphasis on dialogue, on openness to the other, developing that as a kind of hermeneutical virtue, you could say, maybe that also I think aligns with aspects of Fricker's work. So when I came across Fricker's work, and her concept of testimonial injustice and her, discussions of social power, stereotypes, what she refers to as credibility deficit, I found it really compelling, really interesting. And it seemed to me that there were, certain overlaps with Gadamer's work and his concerns, although, she has a really different focus in many ways, and we can get into that in a moment. But, I think that you can see her work as, an advance in many ways on some of the things that Gadamer puts down in terms of his, the framework that he builds. But she's focused more, I think, on instances where you have dialogical breakdown, right? Or discourse that is really inflexible and rigid and doesn't allow for a kind of, openness or thinking another way because, just basically the way that they function they function in advance to see a speaker in a certain way, and that's the very opposite of what of what Gadamer's openness would call for.
That's great. I really like the way you set that up, where Gadamer and Fricker are both talking about dialogue, both talking about communication, both talking about the ways in which they can lead toward truth or away from truth. But Gadamer's emphasis is more on the ways in which this can work out well, and Fricker's emphasis is more on the ways in which these things could break down. So I'm interested in your piece on where you talked about contrasting Gadamer's account of prejudgment and Fricker's account of identity prejudice, because I haven't seen that so much in other literature about Gadamer and Fricker. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so maybe we could start just, by quickly talking about what does Gadamer mean, just very briefly about, prejudgments, and then try to, link that to or highlight where I see some overlaps, and then also maybe some points of difference. So Gadamer's notion of prejudgments comes out of his discussion, as you know, right, of his critique of a one-sided view, right, of negative prejudices, or I like the word better, prejudgments, just because of the baggage that prejudice has, and he wants to get rid of some of that, or at least to show that there is a positive side to prejudgment. So it's a critique of certain enlightenment, maybe rationalistic, kind of view. So he doesn't deny, of course, that there are negative prejudgments, right? He's well aware of that, but he wants to focus on prejudgments understood more as, being fundamental to us as historical beings, right? And as he puts it, that function as conditions for understanding. But because prejudgments function as, conditions of understanding, and they can't be, made completely explicit, you could also see, I think, Gadamer's hermeneutics as a kind of critique of a certain view. You could also tie this to the Enlightenment of a fully transparent self. He doesn't think that's the case. So he emphasizes how we are, always in the middle of things, right? In medias res, we're always working out, revising our prejudgments that, we've inherited. Now, Fricker, you could maybe say in contrast, as I said, indicated before, she's interested in these prejudices primarily that harm us, that harm others. Well, they harm us too, but they harm others. So her account of testimonial injustice is just particularly focused on, as I read her, identity prejudices. Okay, identity prejudices. So, in other words, like if we ask the question, what actually happens, when one as a speaker experiences testimonial injustice? The basic idea, and this is the short story, she gives a much more complicated story with a lot of terms that would have to go back and read again her work to get straight on. But the basic idea is that speakers, let's say because of maybe their gender or their sexual orientation or their ethnicity, right? They experience what she calls a credibility deficit, and they're harmed in their capacity as a knower. That is, they're seen and they're understood by a hearer in advance of that person even saying anything, before a word even comes out of his or her or their mouths, right? As maybe being intellectually inferior, or not having something to say, not having sort of moral credibility or something along those lines. So her work focuses on how a person, as a result of belonging to a certain social group, right, where you have these negative stereotypes that are operative in a kind of atmospheric way, they experience a kind of epistemic harm as well as ethical harm. So given her focus, right, on namely these harmful discourses, these harmful prejudices that are, as I said earlier, inflexible, rigid, she's doing something, at least as I read her, she's doing something that's consonant with Gadamer's project, but nonetheless goes beyond it, right? It's focusing in an area or on topics that Gadamer really didn't just, spend a lot of time with, although I don't think that he's not unaware that you have these kinds of, dialogues that go on that shape people and that can harm them.
That's great, Cynthia. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for what you had to say. That makes a lot of sense, and it really helps see how Gadamer and Fricker together can help us better understand epistemic injustice.
Sure.
The second philosopher we're going to talk to is Georgia Warnke. Georgia is the Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Riverside, and she's also the Director for the Center of Ideas and Society. Georgia Warnke, it's so great you can join us. You're one of the few people who have written on Gadamer and epistemic injustice. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how you see hermeneutics able to contribute to the debates over epistemic injustice.
So the way Fricker talks about epistemic injustice involves two sides, right? Testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. And in each case, the injustice stems from a kind of power imbalance. So you're not, a testimonial injustice, you're not given credibility as a speaker because of what she calls structural identity prejudice. In hermeneutic injustice, you can't, marginalized groups are prevented from articulating certain of their concerns, interests, experiences, because they haven't been part of the kind of group that develops the hermeneutical resources for the community or the society. So, and her example of that, of course, is sexual harassment, right? So in each case, she wants to re-equalize the power relations through things like virtuous listening and so on. But it seems to me that if you follow Gadamer's hermeneutic track, the re-equalizing is written into hermeneutic understanding from the beginning, because Gadamer takes it for granted that if we are talking to someone or reading something, it's because we want to learn something. We want to know something we don't know. And so you start from the premise of not knowing. And that allows you to take seriously the claims that your interlocutor or the book is raising. So I think the first thing that hermeneutics or Gadamer's hermeneutics does is to kind of write the necessity of equality into the interaction. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the things you've written about or raised concerns about is the way Fricker argues for a limit on virtuous listening. And you contrast that with what Gadamer says about dialogue. I wonder if you could say more about that today.
Yeah, so she, when she talks about virtuous listening, she says that there are certain, and I think this is true of her claims in general, that in order to re-equalize or to get over these structural prejudices, we have to be, what is the language she uses? We have to downgrade or upgrade our credibility judgments, as if we already knew not only that we were prejudiced, but exactly what we were prejudiced about. And the whole Gadamer's point is, look, it's by talking to other people, it's by reading books that you're kind of struck and brought up short, because all of a sudden a prejudice that you had becomes clear to you. You don't know before, oh, I'm prejudiced, so I have to up my credibility quotient here. You don't know you're prejudiced, so you have to go in thinking, I don't know, and I am going to take seriously what you say. And so Fricker not only doesn't say that, she says, look, you don't always have to practice virtuous listening, right? So there's some cases where you know you're prejudiced, so you have to kind of take time to be listening in this kind of virtuous listening way. But other points, somebody who seems nuts may just be nuts, right? So once again, I guess I don't understand how that allows you to overcome your prejudices, right? Because you're supposed to somehow know that you are prejudiced and then engage in virtuous listening. Whereas Gadamer's point seems to be, look, you have to engage in virtuous listening all the time precisely because you don't know what you're prejudiced about. And so unless you take the other seriously all the time, you're never going to be struck. You're never going to be able to kind of understand or clarify what your own prejudices are. And I think this is, so it gets criticized for thinking, well, then you're just giving all the power to the person you're listening to, which I think doesn't make any sense, because I'm listening to your claims and comparing them to what I now see were my assumptions doesn't mean that I'm all of a sudden going to give up, right, what I already thought. It's sort of like not giving listeners the kind of agency to listen thoughtfully, to compare what they're hearing to what they already thought or didn't know they already thought and now understand that they thought, and figure out where they come down on this. And I think most of the time we come down neither where we were nor where the other person or interlocutor is, but somewhere more kind of complex and nuanced and deeper.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that with us. I really appreciate you joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
The third Gadamer scholar we're going to talk with is Lauren Barthold. Lauren is a professor of philosophy at Emerson College and the executive director of the Heathmore Center for Cultural Engagement. Lauren Barthold, welcome. I'm so glad you could join us today. You're one of the few Gadamer scholars who've actually brought together hermeneutics and epistemic injustice.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you got started on this question, on this topic?
Yeah, I suppose there are two reasons. One was practical. I had a fellowship at the University of Connecticut at the time, and there was a lot of people there doing work on virtue epistemology, but more to the point. And so that, I guess, made me curious, because I was actually beginning to write my book at that point, and that really made me curious about the question, what might dialogue have to say to discussions of epistemic virtue? And then turning specifically to Fricker's work, I think I see her as sort of extending and deepening Nietzsche's more bombastic claims, right, that physiology, culture, and history all are much more prevalent shapers of thinking, beliefs, than our rationality is. So, I think I sort of credit him as being one of the first observers of this, but obviously Fricker's work went a lot deeper in terms of a phenomenology and a critical analysis of how do social identities impede our understanding both of the world around us in terms of hermeneutic injustices, but also how we understand other people and how we treat other people as understanders.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. I've never thought about bringing Nietzsche in the conversation, but as soon as you mentioned it, I see what you're talking about. So the book is Overcoming Polarization in the Public Square. Right, so everyone should buy that book. That's where you go into depth these arguments. Now, in that book, you make this distinction between open-mindedness and openness. And I usually think of them together, but you make a really nice distinction between one which is more toward what Fricker's talking about and one which is more toward Gadamer's talking about, if I understand it.
Yeah. So I think the Gadamerian influence here, with the focus on mutual understanding and interpretation, leads me to be critical of, again, just putting beliefs into play when we're thinking about truth or persuasion, right, or correcting people's thinking or right action, etc. And so what I like about openness is it steers the focus away from thinking about when I'm being open, that means I have to be willing to, I have to enter into a conversation, sort of take that belief out of my mind, put it on the table. Right now, my mind is open, and we are going to, talk about whether the earth is flat or whether Trump won the election. And I need to take my beliefs out and put them on the table, which I think, we understand existentially to be impossible, but research also backs that up, right? That we're just not able to, first of all, identify our beliefs and our shortcomings, oftentimes shortcomings of our beliefs. And two, even if we do, if we're able to identify beliefs or shortcomings like prejudices, other forms of cognitive bias, that we often don't have the willpower. And again, here, I just finished teaching a section on Nietzsche, so that's why I'm coming at this with new eyes, Nietzschean eyes, and making the connection. But, we don't have the willpower, the ability, our wills are not strong enough to just say, now I will be colorblind. Mm-hmm. So what the focus on openness then does is to shift away from isolated beliefs to the person in general, to the existential experiences of the other as a human being with a past, with a culture, with their own limitations, etc. And so, as I talk about in my book, which I have also a chapter on Martin Buber, and I like to, sort of show these Gadameryan connections too, with the focus on the thou. So I think what openness does is really allows us to treat the other as a thou and not as an it. And it, by treating another as an it, I would be reducing them to one or more of their beliefs, right? You're a Trump supporter.
Right.
And I hate Trump supporters, therefore I'm not going to talk to you.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to try to persuade you that you're wrong. So what openness does is when we come into the conversation, I can say, David, you seem like a pretty smart, educated, you're even a Gadameryan. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to be such a fan of Trump? So what the emphasis is on there is, again, on interpretation. I think this is the hermeneutic component, trying to understand how you or others interpret their experiences, right? Your lived experiences. And why do you put the specific interpretation you do onto it, right? And so, again, it's really about understanding who you are as a person, your experiences that have led you to hold certain views. And through that, again, this is sort of the Gadameryan component, we come away with a mutual understanding. We are more likely, there's no guarantee, of course, but we're more likely to then see the other person as a human being. Yeah. So I think that's what openness allows for, a connection without us sacrificing the integrity of individual beliefs.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. I think I should point out I'm not a Trump fan, but it was a powerful example. It got my attention. That's great. And I like the way that openness is almost more toward a person than a position. We're open. You might be open-minded toward a view or a position, and openness tends to be more toward the person and understanding how this position is integrated into their life.
Right. And it's open specifically in terms of the interpretations they give, right? Because two people could have the same interpretations and end up with very different belief structures. And then also, I think this really connects up with meaning, right? So what meaning? That's another way of thinking about it, is like, what meaning do you attach to your beliefs? Yeah. And by telling that story, it will also similarly, I think, expose a sort of history of how one came to those sorts of beliefs. So it's a way of allowing connection without sacrificing, again, the integrity of one's beliefs, that nobody's going to walk into a conversation and just say, oh yeah, well, I'm a Christian and I'm gonna, just pretend that I'm not to talk to you or something. That's not possible.
Not possible. Great. Thank you very much, Lauren. I appreciate you coming here today and talking to us. I think it's really helped see the ways in which we can bring hermeneutics together with epistemic injustice to move the issues forward.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Great to speak with you, David.
So that gives you an idea of some of the great work that's already been done on the relevance of hermeneutics for epistemic injustice. We have Cynthia Nielsen talking about the ways in which traditions and prejudices and prejudgments are conceived of differently between Fricker and Gadamer, where Gadamer has a much more nuanced understanding of the role of prejudgments, and not simply an idea that prejudgments are things we have to get rid of in order to judge appropriately. We have Lauren Bartold emphasizing the difference between openness and open-mindedness, entering into dialogue open to the person, rather than simply being open-minded about their views, as if we could put our own views aside in the process. And Georgia Warnicki talking about the importance of realizing in the dialogue the way in which our privilege is operating to bring about testimonial injustice, right? Rather than before the dialogue learning how to bracket our privilege in order to create a situation of testimonial justice. So all three are bringing ideas from Gadamer to the table. The ideas of the importance of dialogue, the ideas of the importance of openness, and the ideas of the importance of prejudgments. But all three are also focusing on testimonial injustice more than hermeneutical injustice. Now, we said that any virtue that is a response to testimonial injustice will also be a response to hermeneutical injustice, because testimonial injustice is one of the main ways in which hermeneutical injustice manifests itself. But we also want to ask specifically, what does hermeneutics have to say that helps us better understand hermeneutical injustice and hermeneutical justice?